talk about bridges than another Alex, who is going to start a session on how to not burn your bridges, protecting from bridges from the most recent hacks. And Alex is from Quantstamp. He lives in Dubai. If you guys are based in Dubai, you can find him there. And he started working in this space in 2017. And I'm sure other security roles before that. So Alex, will hand it off to you so you have your maximum time.
Hello, everyone. Well, I'm Alex Murashkin. I'm head of infrastructure at Quantstamp. So, yeah, bridges continue to be a hot topic, with nearly half of all DeFi exploits being related to bridges, even nowadays, according to Token Terminal. Last year alone, bridge hacks led to more than $2 billion worth of assets lost. And if we consider the total value lost since the start of the bull market, this number exceeds $2.5 billion. This work is an extension of an earlier work by my colleagues and myself. We recently published a paper called Not Quite Water Under the Bridge, Review of Cross-Chain Bridge Hacks. My coworkers did presentations on a similar topic at ETH Denver last year, ETH Portland, also other venues. Also, my coworker Martin gave a version of this talk at DeFi Denver as well. In this work, we mostly focus on 2022, basically hacks or exploits that happened throughout last year. But first, we introduce some concepts. Bridge is a software application that is used to move assets from one chain to another. Essentially, if an actor on the left-hand side wants to move ETH into another chain, bridges would be facilitating this transition. While we say that assets are moved from one chain to another, in actuality, assets are usually locked on one chain, and then on another chain, there is another version of that asset that is being minted by a component that we will call the debt issuer, whereas the original assets will be normally held in what we call the custodian. And at the same time, communicator is usually an off-chain component that facilitates the interaction between the custodian and the debt issuer. Withdrawals happen in a similar way. So the actor on the right-hand side expresses interest in burning some of the debt tokens, some version of ETH on that other chain. And that issuer sends a message to the custodian through the communicator so that the custodian can release the assets if the proper proofs are in place. Now let's move on to exploits and attacks. In 2022, there has been plenty of attacks on bridges. Most of them were successful from a perspective of the attacker. Here you can see that the attacks are widespread throughout the year, and the total loss here is more than 2 billion. And what we are going to do now is we'll go over each attack one by one so that we can understand exactly what happened and how we can learn from that. And the reasons attack are so widespread is because bridges are such complex systems. Usually, so such systems, they have lots of points of failure. And even though we discussed just the custodian, debt issuer, and communicator, those three components, but there's actually more than that. The system boundary doesn't end there. We have the token interfaces related to assets, ERC20 interfaces. There could be network level attacks, such as 51% attacks on each side of the bridge. And also there is a front end, a possibility of an exploit somewhere in the front end, right? So it's possible to trick users into using the incorrect substitute of a contract rather than the real actual bridge. And we'll be using this smaller diagram on the right-hand side to classify the attacks. So the first attack was actually good news because it was averted in January 2022. The token interface and custodian kind of parts of the bridge system were involved in the attack. What happened was that users who interacted with the bridge approved the bridge to spend certain tokens on behalf of the bridge. And some users, of course, it's very easy to make a mistake and do the infinite approval so that it pretty much grants a lot of access to a bridge. And the attacker was able to exploit a smart contract error related to input validation and call the token contract on behalf of the bridge, therefore taking the assets that belong to the user. Another January attack involving the custodian was related to exploiting faulty deposit logic in a smart contract. Essentially, calling deposit in the bridge contract without providing ETH that is backing this deposit was possible and therefore was exploited by an attacker. So that's kind of another smart contract related issue. The month after that, this time it was that issuer that was the focus of the attack. So signature verification on the target chain contained an issue, a bug, and an attacker was able to falsify the input account that was not properly validated, which resulted in a loss of funds. So the root cause here is also a smart contract error, and in this case specifically, it was a deprecated function in the target chain's ecosystem. The next attack of February was also related to the custodian, and similar to the second attack, it was related to an issue in the deposit logic. So unfortunately, wrapped and unwrapped assets were processed differently, and they were not. The fact of the deposit was not properly determined. Therefore, the root cause here we also identify as an issue in a smart contract, more specifically in the deposit logic, and it was also related to the custodian component of the bridge. In March, there was a different attack. This time, surprisingly, it did not involve a smart contract issue. This time it was private keys being compromised, what was the root cause. So according to what we were able to read about this attack was that the attacker managed to get access to 4 nodes and an ability to get 1 extra signature from a DAO, which resulted in essentially controlling the basically the consensus mechanism of the nodes and being able to having the ability to withdraw the funds. And in this case, allegedly that the keys were acquired through a phishing attempt. Another attack involving compromised private keys happened in June as well, where the attacker got access to 2 private keys, and the vault was basically 2 out of 5 signatures required, and in this case, the exploit also was possible since the threshold was of the multisig was reached. And finally, another attack involving compromised private keys. It was related to essentially the tools that allow you to generate a vanity address. And in this case, it was pretty much not that difficult to predict that certain projects would use that tool, and therefore it was possible to essentially figure out the admin account of the given project. So here as a root cause, we also list as a compromised private key. The next attack from August last year It was involving the custodian as well. So in this case, it was basically an upgrade that introduced an issue which allowed a special trusted root to be authorized. And in this case, the flawed logic allowed to pass signature validation algorithm. And yeah, unfortunately, this enabled token transfer and unlocking. In this case, we also list smart contract error as the root cause, and more specifically, an issue with proof validation. And finally, the October attack last year involving a custodian. It pretty much it was possible for an attacker to be registered as a breach relayer and be able to essentially provide forged proofs of deposit, and which also in turn allowed transfer and unlock of the tokens. And here, yeah, the root cause we also regard as smart contract error, and more specifically wrong proof validation. So what can we learn from this? So out of 9 attacks that we considered, that we managed to find the information regarding in 2022, 8 of the attacks were related to the custodian, which is not surprising because custodians are essentially honeypots where all the original assets are locked in. And of course, it will be very tempting for an attacker to try to find ways to access that honeypot. 6 of the attacks were related to smart contract errors, which is also not too surprising. But at the same time, what was interesting is that 3 attacks exploited compromised private keys. So what it means is that even if you have smart contracts in order, it's still possible that if you don't manage your infrastructure well, if you don't manage, if you don't follow best practices for keeping private keys, then you might be under attack as well. So 2 attacks involved wrong proof validation. It's not significant considering the whole the whole set of attacks we considered. However, it also means that if there is a weak spot in smart contract validation, then that could be proof validation. Also, we saw attacks involving token interfaces, maybe not necessarily directly, but kind of rather indirectly involving, for example, transfer from methods or, for example, permit functions. So there are some attacks in the past, actually in 2021, that involved token interface. But last year we only considered one that I presented at the beginning, the one that was averted. So how do we mitigate the attacks, right? So first of all, even before you deployed your bridge or smart contract, the important part is considering how you generate the keys for the deployer or for admin accounts. So the suggestion here is to never use a known tool or known method for generating private keys, and also trying to make it so that there is no access to internet on the machine that you're using to generate the private keys. So just for additional security. Second item there is making sure that you handle all possible corner cases in smart contracts, not just smart contracts actually, because most of the communicators are off-chain components, and there could be some cases missed there as well. So making sure that deposit logic is really hack-proof in that case. Using best practices for securing private keys, so definitely that's an important consideration. That also involves Web 2.0 security. Having higher thresholds for multi-sigs, that is something easy to enable, but at the same time, we've seen the case when the multi-sig essentially allowed 2 out of 5 to sign, and therefore to succeed the attack. Then number 5 recommendation here is avoid centralization of power in a contract. So we saw the previous talk where Another Alex talked about essentially decentralized bridges, and I think that's something to be considered as well. So what can happen in centralized bridges is that you are given too much power, so the admins of the contract are given too much power, and they can withdraw all the assets at once. If you absolutely have to use that kind of version, that approach, what should be considered is some time lock for withdrawals, or having some kind of multi-stage approvals in order to get the assets out. Or what we've seen in some bridges, they essentially treat small and large deposits very differently, and withdrawals as well, which also makes sense because you probably need a higher threshold for higher value withdrawals. Number 6 here is carefully checking if legacy or test-only functionality is disabled in the production system. This is more related to general best coding and deployment practices, not necessarily related to smart contracts or to blockchain applications. However, in blockchain applications, this becomes particularly important because you can't always upgrade the code and disable that functionality. And it's always very difficult to track if some part of the code was executed without you knowing that. Number 7 here is remaining aware that asset functionality such as transfer from and permit exists, and not all ERC20 compatible contracts implement this functionality in the same way, right? There could be some variations. Some ERC20 contracts have a fallback function. Some of them do not have that. So definitely it's something to be aware in order to design the bridge very well. You need to make sure that it works for all possible weird cases of assets, or maybe being able to whitelist or remove from consideration assets that are not compatible. And finally, of course, regular Web 2.0 security. It's always going to be important, so definitely something to consider whenever you're building a bridge, especially for the communicator component, because it's essentially a regular off-chain component that needs to be properly secured. This brings me to the end of the presentation. Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks a lot for listening. Please drop by our booth. It's really nice, as you can see from here. Yeah, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll be here after the talk. Thank you so much.